My name is Daniel and I'm 29 years old. I spent the last few years working as a paramedic in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's a job I enjoy, especially since I've been a problem solver my whole life. My wife, or rather my girlfriend at the time of this story, is Sarah. She's 30 and works at a bakery designing cakes. Sarah has this creative, free spirited energy about her that contrasts my own analytic mind, and it's one of the many things that drew me to her. Sarah and I had been together for 4 years. One of the first things we bonded over was our love of the outdoors. Some couples enjoy fine dining or extravagant vacations, but for us, nothing beats the simplicity of being surrounded by nature. Whether it's hiking, fishing, or setting up camp miles away from the nearest road, we both feel most at peace under the stars with a fire crackling between us. For months leading up to this trip, I had been planning to propose to Sarah. I knew it had to happen outdoors. There was no way I was doing it in a restaurant or some crowded event. Sarah deserved something more personal, more meaningful. When she mentioned wanting to go camping in the Appalachian Mountains, I knew it was the perfect opportunity. I imagined us sitting by a campfire, the ring glinting in the flames as I took a knee, and only the forest witnessing her saying yes. We picked a weekend in early September of 2019. The timing was ideal. The cooler weather meant fewer bugs and more time to snuggle up in our sleeping bags. It also wasn't Sarah's first time camping in the Appalachians. She'd grown up exploring them with her family, and I knew how much those mountains meant to her. She was my guide, and I trusted her instincts in the wild. Sarah is the adventurous one. She's the type to wander off trail to see what's over there, or wake me up at dawn because she spotted some rare bird. I'm the cautious one, the planner. I handle the maps, triple check the gear, bring the first aid kit, and make sure we have enough food. Together, we make a great team. I keep us grounded, and she makes sure we're always exploring something new. I remember packing for the trip, feeling the weight of the ring box. It felt surreal. I knew that by the end of the weekend, everything about our relationship could change in the best way possible. Well, change was coming, but not in the way that I expected. Not in a way that I even ever expected. The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful. There's no other way to put it. The air was cool, especially in the morning, but it carried that scent that you can only experience in the great outdoors. It was the kind of place that felt alive, and it was a perfect spot to leave behind the chaos of the city and to reconnect with nature. We'd chosen a remote part of the forest, a few hours hike from the nearest trailhead. Sarah had found the location on one of her outdoor forums. People there described the panoramic view and the relative solitude, and those were the two things that drew her to that spot. It wasn't even an official campground, so there were no marked trails and no other campers nearby. And you know what? That's exactly what we were looking for. A place where it felt like the entire mountain belonged to just the two of us. We set up our tent on a flat patch of ground near a small clearing. We spent the first day on an outcrop that gave you a view of everything around us. It was the kind of scene you could stare at forever. And I knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for. I pulled out the ring, forgetting my vision of proposing by the fire. This was better. My heart raced as I knelt beside her, pretending to adjust my boot before slipping the small box from my pocket. Her answer came immediately. An enthusiastic yes, followed by a hug so tight it knocked me off balance. She tackled me to the ground before I could even put the ring on her finger. That moment was perfect. One of those rare times in life that feels like it belongs in a movie. We stayed up late that night, talking about our future, about the life that we were going to build together, and occasionally stealing glances at the ring on her finger. The way it reflected the fire was perfect. The next morning, we woke up with the kind of energy that only comes from good news and good coffee. Sarah insisted on taking a long hike to explore the area. We spent hours wandering through the woods, taking pictures of waterfalls, wildlife, trees, and of course, the ring. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was starting to sink again. We cooked another meal, stoked the fire, and settled in for what we thought was going to be another peaceful night. But something shifted as the darkness fell. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small, subtle things that were easy to dismiss. The woods around us, which had been alive with sounds of birds, grew really quiet. Sarah was the first to notice it. She stared into the woods with a furrowed brow, and I asked her what was wrong. She said it was just quieter than she was comfortable with. I listened, but there was nothing to hear, and I guess that was the problem. The usual nighttime opus of insects and hoots was gone. It was like the forest had gone away. Maybe it's the weather, I said, trying to sound casual, but the hair on the back of my neck was definitely starting to stand up. She shrugged it off too and said, yeah, maybe I was right. We tried to brush it off and focus on the fire, but the unease lingered. It was an unnatural kind of silence. As we sat there, it felt like the forest was watching us or waiting for something to happen. It was the first hint that this trip wasn't going to end the way that we'd imagined. That strange silence lingered for hours and just grew heavier. Every crackle of the fire seemed unnaturally loud because there were no other sounds. Even Sarah, who was usually chatty and lighthearted, was just quiet. She kept glancing into the trees, which creeped me out because she had a lot more experience with the wild than I did. It was some time after midnight, though, when the first sound broke through the silence. It was like a soft, whispered breath. At first, I passed it off as the wind, but I realized there was no wind. This sound was deliberate, like something moving. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. I nodded, my hand tightening on the flashlight beside me. "It's probably just an animal," I said, but I don't think I believed myself. And then the rustling grew louder, and it was circling the edge of our campsite. Whatever it wasn't moving like a deer or any other animal that I'd ever encountered. It stopped, started, and then shifted direction, like it was testing the boundaries of our camp or seeing where the patches of darkness were closer to us. I grabbed the gun from my pack, a small pistol I brought for emergencies, and loaded it just to be safe. We sat frozen, staring into the dark woods, straining to see anything past the flickering firelight. And then this high-pitched wail cut through the silence. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Half scream, half animal cry, but entirely supernatural. The sound sent a chill racing down my spine, and I knew it did the same thing for Sarah, because she grabbed my arm and her nails dug into my skin. She was scared. So was I. She asked what was out there, but I was clueless, and I asked her the same thing. She'd had more experience with this after all, but the look on her face made me realize she was just as clueless as me. The rustling picked up again, but faster now and moving closer. I swept my flashlight over the trees, looking for what was out there. At first, there was nothing, just endless trunks and shadows, but then I saw it. A figure crouched low to the ground, pale and unnaturally thin. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin as twigs. It was so thin it looked like it shouldn't even be alive. It moved with this jerky, inhuman posture. Its head was twitching side to side like it was sniffing the air or something. The movements were so erratic, it almost looked like a bad download of a movie. You know, the ones that keep having to load? The flashlight landed on this thing's face, and I felt my stomach twist up. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth hung open, showing rows of these tiny little jagged teeth. Multiple rows, like a shark. Its skin was stretched so tight over its bones it was almost translucent, and its fingers ended in claws that scraped the ground as it moved. Sarah screamed, and the thing's head snapped towards us. It actually looked like its mouth curled into this horrible grin, and it was making this hoarse breathing noise. It let out another wail, this one lower, and it began crawling towards us at a disturbing speed. I yelled at her to get into the tent. I pulled her to her feet. She hesitated for a split second, staring at whatever the hell this thing was, before scrambling toward the tent. I fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare it off, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it let out a hiss that would have actually made me pee myself if I wasn't concentrating so hard on getting Sarah to safety. I fired again, this time aiming just in front of it, but it just kept coming. By the time we got inside the tent and zipped it shut, that thing was at the edge of our camp. I could hear its claws scraping against the dirt. It was like it was toying with us. We huddled together in the tent, the gun clutched tightly in my hands. Sarah was shaking. She was pale. I felt helpless. The thin fabric of the tent wasn't any type of protection, and we both knew it. Then came the noises. At first, it was just the creatures hissing, like this wet, choking sound. But soon, those noises began to shift into something that almost sounded human. Daniel, it croaked. It was drawing out my name, like a taunt. The voice was raspy and distorted, like it was mimicking the sound of speech, but couldn't quite get it right. Sarah clamped her hand over her mouth, probably to stifle a scream. I don't know. I tightened my grip on the gun. Every muscle in my body was tense. I tried to think of a way to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The creature circled the tent slowly, and it was dragging its hand across the fabric. Occasionally it would stop and press against it harder, and its claws were tracing the outline of the poles or something. Each time it did, Sarah would flinch, and I'd raise the gun ready to fire. The worst part was the whispering. Between the hisses and the gurgles that this thing was making, it began muttering what sounded like more words, like fragments of sentences. Whatever it was that was out there could mimic certain words, but it didn't sound human at all. Like it had no human type of emotion in its speech. I heard words like stay, Daniel, Sarah, help. Like it had learned words, and it knew it could influence people somehow, but it wasn't using them properly, because there was nothing human about the way it was saying it. But I got the distinct impression that it was trying to set a trap. Somehow this thing knew our names. I thought about how it might have been watching us, learning from us, and now it was using our own voices against us. It hissed, dragging out the syllables of these words. Hours passed like this, the creature stalking and taunting us from outside the tent. Every so often, it would let out another wail. I kept the gun trained on the entrance, my finger over the trigger, while Sarah clung to me. At some point, exhaustion hit me like a brick, but I refused to close my eyes longer than a blink. I couldn't risk letting my guard down. I had to protect Sarah. The whispers and the hisses blended into this sickening symphony that felt like it would never end. And the longer it went on, the more words I recognized. Come. Don't leave. Help. Finally, though, as dawn approached, the noises began to fade away. The hissing and the muttering grew fainter, and the scraping of the claws on the ground moved further away. By the time the first light of morning shone on the tent, the forest was silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt like a relief, like that thing was gone. I don't think they like the sunlight very much. I don't know if it hurts them, or maybe they just know they can't hide in it. But I know as it got lighter, that thing took off. We didn't dare leave the tent until the sun was fully up, though. When we finally unzipped it and stepped outside, the campsite was empty, except for the faint, lingering smell of something foul. Neither of us said a word. We packed up our gear in record time, left behind anything that wasn't essential, and started the long hike back to the car. I'd never been more scared in my life. But that creature never appeared again. It was gone, but the memory of that night was far from gone. In fact, it's been 5 years since that night, and not a day goes by that I don't even think about it. Sarah and I made it back to the car that morning without incident, but the drive home was quiet. Neither of us could find the words to talk about what we'd seen. It felt impossible to explain, even to each other. When we got back to Pittsburgh, we tried to return to our normal lives. At first, it seemed like we might be able to move on. Sarah threw herself into her work, and I did the same, but the memory of that night just kept lingering. For weeks, one of us, or both of us, would wake up in the middle of the night. Our bodies would be trembling. Nightmares. Mostly of those eyes, but other times a scenario where that thing was at our house. We'd hear whispers from the corners of our bedroom or claws against the windowsill before we woke up. I'd lie awake at night, gun on the nightstand, straining to hear the slightest noise. Sleep sometimes became a rare luxury, and when we did sleep, more nightmares. For a while, we considered seeing a therapist, but how could we explain what we'd experienced? Who would believe us? Instead, we just stopped talking about it altogether. It became this silent agreement. The creature just didn't exist if we didn't acknowledge it. But ignoring it didn't make it go away either. We've kept this story to ourselves all these years. At first, it was out of fear of being ridiculed, but over time it became something else. A kind of superstition. Talking about it feels like an invitation, as if speaking its name might bring it back. I've spent countless nights trying to make sense of it, reading every story, every myth, every legend that even remotely resembles what we saw. The term rake came up once. It was supposed to be fake, but believe me, it's not. But what the hell is a rake? Some ancient predator? A spirit? Something worse? Something that came to life because so many people thought that it was real? Who the hell knows? Despite it all, Sarah and I are still together. We got married 2 years after the trip. Would have done it sooner if COVID didn't happen, but we waited until we could have a big wedding again. It's strange to think about how that night started as one of the happiest moments of our lives and ended as something we'd never fully recover from. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, lurking in the shadows. I'm sure of it. It's waiting for its next victims. We were lucky to make it out alive, and trust me, we're not about to push our luck again. I never thought I'd be telling this story. It's one of those things that stick with you. Every now and then, when I'm lying awake at night, I still see its face, especially the hollow eyes staring back at me. My therapist says writing it down might help, so here I am. This happened over a decade ago, back when I was 16. My name's Eric, and at the time, I lived in a small West Virginia town where nothing ever happened. Everyone knew everyone else's business. The weekends were spent either hanging out at the local diner or finding trouble in the woods. My friends, Sam and Danny, were my partners in crime. Sam was the oldest of us at 17, though you wouldn't know from the way he acted. He was the loud one, always cracking jokes and coming up with ridiculous plans to keep us entertained. He loved hiking and exploring, so he was usually the one dragging us into whatever mischief we ended up in. Danny, on the other hand, was the youngest at 15. He was the cautious one, the kind of guy who double-checked everything twice before going along with Sam's schemes. He was into photography, always lugging around this beat-up old camera that he'd saved up for. He wanted to be a wildlife photographer someday, which meant he didn't mind our trips into the woods as much as I did. Danny was shorter than Sam and me, with thick glasses and a personality that made him seem older than he was. And then there was me, Eric, the middleman. I wasn't as reckless as Sam or as careful as Danny. I liked riding my bike in video games, and I mostly went along with their plans because what else was there to do? We were bored kids in a boring town. Looking back, I can't remember whose idea it was to check out the old construction site. I think Sam might have heard about it from some older kids at school. It was supposed to be this big shopping center or something, but the company went bankrupt halfway through, and they just left it there, half-built and abandoned. Naturally, it became a local legend. People said it was haunted, that you could hear weird noises at night, but we figured it was just raccoons or stray dogs. Why would it even be haunted, you know? We'd been there once during the day. It was creepy, but not enough to scare us off. Sam had this brilliant idea to go back at night to see if the stories were true. I didn't want to go. Danny didn't either, but Sam had a way of convincing people, and before I knew it, we were making plans for the weekend. Little did we know, that night would be the scariest night of any of our lives. It was late July, the kind of night where it was warm enough to stay out as long as you wanted. We were out of school for the summer, and we didn't really have a strict curfew. The three of us met up at 9 p.m., armed with flashlights and not much else. The construction site was about a mile out of town, past Mr. Davis's farm. The site itself was huge, at least to us back then it was. There were half-finished buildings scattered around. They reminded me of skeletons coming out of the ground. Piles of concrete blocks and rusted rebar were all over the place, along with a few pieces of heavy machinery that looked like they'd been abandoned in a hurry. The ground was uneven and the pavement was cracked and loose. We climbed through a gap in the chain-link fence that surrounded the site. Sam was in the lead, naturally. There were noises like distant rustling and the occasional snap of branches. Probably just animals, we told ourselves, but it didn't do much good to calm my nerves. I guess the first thing I noticed, looking back now, was how the air around the site felt different. Like static electricity or something. Back then, I thought it was just because I was scared of getting caught, but after reading so much about supernatural encounters, a lot of them come with that static feeling. Sam was asking where we were going first, already shining his flashlight towards the largest building in the center of the site. That's what he had his sights set on. It was supposed to be the main shopping area, but now it was open on both sides and had a roof that looked like it could cave in at any moment. Danny mentioned that to Sam, that the building looked like it was going to collapse, but Sam wanted to go look around anyways, promising that we'd be fine. He headed towards the building, and like idiots, we followed him. We went inside and started to explore. Danny found a dark stain on the floor and told us to come look at it. It looked like oil, thick and black, but the way it was spread out reminded me of claw marks. We wandered deeper into the building, past empty doorways and debris. The place was a maze, and it was easy to see how someone could get lost. Danny started getting antsy. He made a comment about how the air had changed. It was colder in there, even though it wasn't even cold outside. But it was like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. And there was also this smell now, like sulfur or chlorine in a pool. Probably a dead animal, Sam said, but even he sounded less sure of himself now. And to me, it sure as hell didn't smell like some kind of rotting animal. Knowing what I know now, the smell is called ozone. Anyway, we stopped in the middle of a wide open space that probably would have been a food court someday. Sam pulled out a pack of snacks from his jacket. I think more to keep his hands busy than anything else. I asked Danny where his camera was. I guess my mind was on other things until then. He didn't bring it this time. I guess he didn't want to risk it getting damaged, and honestly there wasn't really anything to take pictures of anyway. Then we started hearing the growling noises. But not exactly growling at that point. It was somewhere between a growl and a gurgle, really. It sounded distant, but it echoed through the empty building, and it made my skin crawl, honestly. "What the hell was that?" Danny whispered, and he gripped his flashlight like it was a weapon. Before either of us could respond, we heard another sound. This was like scraping, maybe something dragging itself. It was obvious to all three of us at that point that we were not alone. Maybe there was a homeless person in there, or maybe some kind of injured animal. But after that, the scraping sound stopped and we all started to breathe again. Danny was shining his flashlight all over the place. He was really scared now and kept suggesting that we leave. Something moved just out of his flashlight beam. It moved so fast that I barely saw it. All I caught was a glimpse of something big on all four legs. And now, I was agreeing with Danny. I was ready to go. But Sam said it was probably just a raccoon or something. Whatever I saw wasn't a raccoon. I started arguing with him, but the sounds stopped us cold. Now it sounded like something big was moving around, and it was coming from above us. All three of us froze and looked up at the same time. The roof was just a skeleton of beams and half-finished supports, and there, perched on one of them, like something from a nightmare, was the thing. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I was hoping that it was just somebody in a costume. It was human-like in shape, but the proportions were all wrong, like it'd been stretched out or something. Its skin was sickly pale, almost glowing under the moonlight. It had no hair, no clothes, just bare flesh clinging to bones. Its head was tilted down as it stared down at us. Sam shone his flashlight at it, and I wished that he hadn't. If he hadn't, maybe I wouldn't have been able to make out the face so vividly. Maybe some of those nightmares wouldn't plague me. But this is what I saw. Hollow black eyes, boring into my own. I couldn't look away. It was like this thing had trapped me in its gaze. Its face was smooth and featureless except for the sunken eyes and a mouth that looked like a shark's mouth, full of teeth. Its mouth was open slightly, and I could see all those little teeth, all sharp, dozens and dozens of them. What I mean is multiple rows of teeth. When the light hit it, this thing hissed like a pissed off cat. The creature's head snapped toward Sam so fast I thought it might break its neck. And then it moved, rushing down the beam like a spider. I needed to wake up. I needed to get out of this nightmare. But you know what? I was awake, and this was really happening to us. Danny screamed to run, but his voice was broken, like he was almost too scared to form words. It was too late anyways. That thing dropped to the floor with a thud, and it landed on all fours. We stood there, pressed up against each other, and for a few seconds, I thought we might actually have to work together to fight this thing off. I didn't know what else to do. I just held my flashlight like a club. Up close, it was worse. Its skin was stretched tight over the ribs, and its hands ended in claws that looked like sickles. It let out another gurgle growl and started to crawl towards us, but its movements were ratchety and unnatural. Seeing that thing so close was all we needed to get the hell out of there. We all turned and ran in unison, and I could hear it behind us. It was making this horrible wheezing sound as it kept pace with us. I was absolutely sure I was going to die, because the way it was moving before, this thing was so fast. Danny tripped over a pile of rubble and went down hard. I stopped and grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. He lost his flashlight, but there was no time to stop and grab it. The thing let out this scream like a mix of a woman's wail and some kind of animal snarl. We burst out of the building and into the open air, but we didn't stop running. Sam climbed through the fence first, followed by Danny, and I was the last to go through. I glanced back right before I went through. I saw it standing at the edge of the building. It was standing up on two legs and just looking as scary and menacing as the Demogorgon from Stranger Things, minus that weird head that it has. But the length of the arms and the way that the body was shaped reminded me of that creature. It didn't chase us any further. It just stood there, hunched over and watching us. I scrambled through the fence and didn't stop running until we were back in the woods. And then, we didn't stop running until we were far enough away from that building to see the town lights again. None of us slowed. We just ran for our lives. And for whatever reason, that thing didn't follow. Maybe that building was its home. Maybe it was its territory that was defending. Or maybe it couldn't follow us for some reason. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sam dropped to his knees. Danny and I followed, and we collapsed onto the ground. All three of us just panting. What the hell was that? That's what Danny choked out as we all tried to catch our breath. We lay there trying to figure out what it was that we had just seen. Sam wouldn't say anything other than he didn't know. I think he was afraid to say the words out loud. I spoke up and said it wasn't human. One of us used the term monster. I think it was me, but honestly I don't remember. Although I had no specific name for what type of monster it was. Danny was the first one that said things like that didn't exist, but we saw what we saw. He was afraid people weren't going to believe us if we told them. So as we sat there for a long time, trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened, we promised each other to keep it a secret. Around us, the forest was quiet, and even though we were miles from the site now, I couldn't think anything other than that thing was walking through the forest looking for us. Eventually that was enough to get us up and moving again, and we made the long walk back to town. During that, none of us said much. I think we were afraid that talking might rouse it again. It was like its memory was enough to pull it out of the dark. When we finally made it to the edge of town, we just stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Danny asked if we were sure that we shouldn't tell people. He thought that people should know, but Sam snapped at him, wanting to know what people could know about what we saw. They wouldn't believe us. They would think we were crazy. All we could tell him is that we saw some thing out in an abandoned building that we weren't even supposed to be in. They thought we would just be making it up to avoid being in trouble. I didn't really argue. I thought Sam was right. Who would believe 3 kids who said they saw a monster? Maybe on some level I didn't want to talk about it either. We went our separate ways that night without another word. I crept back into my house and laid in bed all night just staring at the ceiling. I didn't close my eyes at all. For weeks after that, the 3 of us just avoided each other. We weren't mad or anything. It was like we just couldn't stand to be in the same room because it reminded us of that night. I'd see Sam across the hall at school or Danny sitting alone in the cafeteria and we'd just look the other way. None of us wanted to bring it up. Danny stopped taking pictures after that. He'd always been the quiet one, but now he barely spoke at all. And Sam, he only got louder. He was constantly cracking jokes, always looking for the next thrill, like he was trying to drown out the memory with noise and chaos. Me? I just kept my head down. I stopped going into the woods, stopped riding my bike at night. I told myself I was fine, but I wasn't. And you know what? None of us were. It wasn't until years later that we even talked about it again. Life pulled us in different directions. Sam moved to a bigger city, chasing work wherever he could find it after school. Danny went off to college out of state. I stayed in West Virginia. I got a job and tried to live a normal life. It was at Danny's wedding that the 3 of us found ourselves together for the first time in a long time. A couple of years, actually. The reception was winding down. Most of the guests had left, and the 3 of us ended up sitting on the back porch, just like old times. For a while, we talked about the usual, but then the conversation fell quiet, and I could feel what was about to happen next. Sam was the one to bring it up. Do you guys ever think about it? We didn't have to ask him what he meant, and for a moment, neither of us answered. But Danny nodded and said, "Yeah. Not as much as I used to, but yeah." Sam said he still dreamt about it sometimes. I said, "Me too." I told them that I could still see it crouched on that beam. I could see those eyes locked onto mine. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run. What if it caught us? Danny admitted that he looked into what it could be years ago, but never said anything to any of us. He said it was something called a cryptid, but more specifically, he thought it was something called a rake. He said people swear it's a made-up thing, but all 3 of us know better than that. None of us really knew what to say after that, and the conversation kind of ran its course. We sat there for a while after that, but we didn't talk about it after that night. The night moved on, and we went our separate ways again. Every once in a while, I text them or send them a meme or something, catch up with them for a little while, but nothing's like it used to be. None of us even live close to each other anymore. Whatever that thing was and wherever it came from, I don't know. I know it's still out there somewhere, but I hope it's far away from me. I moved, still in West Virginia, but now I'm a few hours from where that nightmare happened. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers us, like we remember it. My name's Ethan, and my younger brother Adam and I have always been close. We grew up in Florence, South Carolina. We didn't have much to do other than entertain ourselves. We'd get into trouble, of course. Nothing serious. But the real trouble, the kind that would end up changing us, came later. We weren't exactly thrill seekers at first, but we had our interests, and they started to lean towards the strange. I'm 27 now. Adam's 24. I work as a bartender at a big restaurant. It's a simple job, but it pays the bills, and I meet interesting people. Adam works at a gym as a personal trainer. It was through Adam that we both got into the whole ghost hunting thing. He's always had a thing for places with history, especially the ones that were either falling apart or were supposed to be haunted. We found a few local paranormal groups online and made a list of places that were supposed to be haunted and close enough to drive to. At first, it just seemed like another one of his phases, but when he bought a cheap EVP recorder and started dragging me along to do these ghost hunts, it started to feel a little more serious. I didn't believe in ghosts, not at first, but Adam was persistent, and eventually I caved. Our first few hunts were in local spots like the old cemetery down by the river, or the abandoned farmhouse a couple of miles out of town. Nothing ever happened, of course. We'd stand in the dark, trying to talk to spirits, trying to get some creepy noises on the recorder, and then we would laugh about it. But then, Adam started getting obsessed. He'd spend hours looking into new places to explore, researching reports on hauntings, reading about disappearances, and I'd follow him, out of curiosity and because it gave us something to do together. One night, though, Adam found something on a message board. A place that was supposedly abandoned, but had a dark reputation. Some old office building that hadn't been used in decades. This building was just outside of town and had been closed for decades, but there are rumors of strange occurrences. Things like disembodied voices, shadows that moved on their own, and most disturbingly, stories about people who'd gone in, only to come out acting off. He was determined we'd check it out. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, but after all the ghost hunts we'd gone on with no real scares, I figured what harm could it do? So we planned it. A weekend trip, just the two of us. Neither of us knew it then, but it was going to be the kind of trip that would change everything. This building had been abandoned for over 50 years apparently, and it was a massive structure. I'd heard the rumors, mostly from Adam of course, who went deep into the ghost hunting forums. But it wasn't until we stood at the edge of the property that I really understood why people were so afraid of it. The place was huge. It was on several acres of overgrown land. This place looked like it could have been a setting for a scary movie. I mean, I should have trusted that feeling right away, but I didn't. We're talking about crumbling brick walls and broken windows, jagged panes that looked like broken teeth. It looked like the building was slowly trying to collapse in on itself too. Adam, as usual, was the one that was excited about it. He'd already pulled out his camera, checking the settings as he walked towards the front entrance. He was hopeful, thinking this was the place where we'd finally find something worth talking about. Well, I mean, he wasn't wrong. I was starting to feel weird, though, like something was already wrong. I mean, this place wasn't an abandoned asylum or a prison like you see most activity in, but it was just an old building that had been left to rot. I thought it was just my imagination, but it was something, a feeling like we weren't alone. Inside, the place was even worse. The floors creaked with every step. It smelled like rotten wood and mildew. The layout looked like it housed several giant rooms for storage or something, big enough for trucks and stuff to deliver into or drive around. Then there were office buildings too. It was 2 stories, but the roof must have been like 50 feet in the air. Some of the roof was glass, but the glass had long been covered by dirt, and it was messed up by so many years of sun beating down on it. Broken furniture was scattered throughout the place. Overturned chairs, broken tables, ripped up mattresses. Someone had squatted there, but I doubted they were still hanging around this gross-ass building. It honestly looked like Whoever had worked there just up and left one day without coming back, and then whoever squatted there did the same. I had a fleeting thought that maybe this place ate them, but I shook it off. This wasn't a Stephen King movie. Some of the walls were covered in peeling paint and cracked plaster. There was a bunch of graffiti too. Some of the windows on the first floor were boarded up. Some were just missing, making it easy for anyone to just enter right into the building. It definitely looked like it might have been haunted. We'd come prepared too. Adam had his camera, along with an EVP recorder, a Geiger, and a flashlight. I had a flashlight too, and a spare, just in case. We both carried our phones, but we weren't expecting to get much signal in here. It was just more of another way of capturing anything that could be weird. Adam also brought a small motion sensor, one of those gadgets that beeps when something triggers it, and a few other ghost hunting tools that I didn't really understand. He wanted to start in the main hallway, and suggested we check the battery levels, since sometimes ghosts can drain the battery life. It wasn't solid proof of their existence, but it'd be enough to prove it to at least us. We spent the first hour or so just walking through the building, snapping pictures and recording sounds. The place was unnervingly quiet, except for our footsteps and our conversation, even though we were talking in a whisper. Why? I couldn't tell you. It's not like we were afraid of being caught in there, but maybe we didn't want to disturb any of the spirits that were wandering the halls. We ended up doing an EVP session in the hallway, and another on the first room that we found. It looked like it could have been an area for receptionists or something. It had a large desk, big enough for a few people to sit at, but even this desk looked like it was about to collapse. It wasn't until we got to the second warehouse area that things really started to feel off, though. Adam set up the motion sensor outside of the room, and the EVP recorder at the other end of the room. I waited outside, shining my flashlight into the room as he marched across the warehouse like the fearless guy that he is. I wasn't as brave. Even from the start of this thing, seeing this warehouse, it just made me hesitate before stepping inside. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the sudden drop in temperature in the area that we were at, or the darkness that stayed even with our flashlights, but for one reason or another, where we were at that moment was even more unnerving to me. Adam, of course, though, was already moving ahead with his camera. His voice was full of excitement, enough to make me roll my eyes. Let's see what we can catch. This is going to be great. Those were the things that he was telling me. I was thinking more of, let's just get out of here and go get a burger. I stood in the doorway, watching him move through the dust and the broken pallets. I couldn't shake that feeling that we weren't alone, though. I glanced back down the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching us, or holding an axe or something, or maybe some apparition darting into another room. But the hall was just empty, just like when we'd entered. Adam pulled me out of my thoughts. He whispered my name, but he sounded different, maybe even afraid. He told me to come over to him, and when I did, he pointed into a corner of the room, up towards this catwalk, and he said he saw something move up there. I asked what it was, but he didn't know. He said he only caught a glimpse of it, but he could have sworn that he saw something. I could see his eyes flicking back and forth, like he was trying to catch something again, and his excitement was gone. Now he looked nervous. I followed his gaze up to the catwalk. The place was dark, lit only by our flashlights, and that corner was all the way across the room. Nothing was there as far as I could tell. I stared at it for a minute, just trying to make sure, and when I was satisfied, I told him there wasn't anything there. He shook his head. He told me he wasn't so sure, and that when he saw whatever it was moving, he felt like something was wrong. I didn't want to admit it, but I could feel it too. Just this creepy uneasiness, and it was only getting stronger. It was almost like the building itself was alive, breathing with us and watching us. And then I started to think about that old Stephen King movie, Rose Red, how the building actually seemed alive. And then I thought maybe the people in here really did get eaten by the building. And that scared me. I didn't sign up for some evil building, just a couple of ghosts. I'd been trying to ignore it, but now that Adam had pointed it out, it was hard to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. So I told him to check the recording. Maybe we caught something. He moved to the EVP recorder quickly and came back in a hurry. Not as brave as when he put it up. The hum of the static filled the room before something else crackled through the speaker. Neither of us said anything at first, just listening. It wasn't until the noise repeated that I recognized it. It was like a whisper or something. Not clear enough to make out words, but it was definitely there, and it sure as hell wasn't one of us. Adam's eyes went wide with excitement, and that adventurous attitude finally came back, because now he was sure that we caught a ghost. That was a voice. We're not alone, Ethan. That was something trying to communicate with us. I heard it too, and I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't the kind of whisper you might hear in a crowded place or something you could explain away. It was too unnatural, like it was an echo of a whisper. It sent another chill down my spine, and I was getting really tired of being afraid. I could feel my heartbeat picking up. I wasn't excited as my brother. This was his hobby, not so much mine. We stood there in silence for a few moments, both of us just staring at the recorder, half expecting the whispers to continue, but it was quiet again. Just static that was being picked up. He wanted to do an actual EVP session. I wanted to get the hell out of there. But I wasn't going to leave him alone, and I sure as hell wasn't going to go wander off by myself while my crazy-ass brother tried to communicate with the spirit world. So we sat there for about 20 minutes, trying to catch something on the recorder, listening for anything that could be in there, and prompting any ghost listening to answer us. After a while, I couldn't take the feeling of the room anymore, and suggested that we go into another room. I used the excuse of finding something better, and it worked. We moved on. We walked through the building, not talking much. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anything unusual. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only got worse the deeper we went. We found an old lunchroom, and the temperature was noticeably colder in there. The air itself felt dense. It actually made it harder to breathe. There was something off about the lunchroom too. It wasn't just cold, it was the smell. It wasn't just mold and decay. There was something worse, something rotten. I stepped closer to the counter where Adam had set up his equipment and noticed the stains on the floor. Dark, dried splotches that I didn't want to think about too much. "Dude, you're not gonna like this," Adam told me. "I swear, something is moving. I think it's over by the kitchen." I followed his gaze to the kitchen door. It was open. I couldn't help but feel the need to back out of the room. My spider senses were on overdrive. We shouldn't be in there. We went over to the door, and it creaked as we pushed it open. There was a long, narrow hallway that went deeper into the building. And I remember thinking to myself that this place was huge, way bigger than I thought. And I hoped that we didn't get lost in there. There was this low buzzing sound in the distance, like electricity humming. But it wasn't coming from any of our equipment. We both stopped. Adam raised his hand, signaling for me to be quiet. And then we both heard this noise that we describe as a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere down the hallway. It was faint, almost like something was dragging itself across the floor. It was the kind of sound you'd expect to hear in an old abandoned place right before something crazy happened. It sounded intentional, like something was moving slowly towards us. I wanted to run and get the hell out of this place, but like I said, I wasn't leaving Adam. Splitting up is how people die in scary movies all the time, and I wasn't about to be a statistic. That scraping noise just kept getting louder, like something was definitely headed towards us. I didn't want to say it, but it felt like I was frozen there. And I could see Adam's hand shaking as he held the camera. His flashlight beam was moving back and forth because he was so shaky. I couldn't tell if he was excited to catch a ghost or scared that we might run into a psycho, but his excitement was very, very noticeable. He asked me what was making the noise, but I couldn't answer him. And then the sound stopped. We're talking total silence. It was like a real-life jump scare, like in the movies when you're waiting for something to pop out and you're holding your breath. And then it actually happened. We saw this, I don't even have words for it. Creature, I guess. Or monster, or demon, I have no clue. It was at the far end of the hallway. This long, super skinny figure. The monster was tall, way taller than a man. Its body was bony. Its limbs were long and even bonier, like it was just skin over bones, and that skin was stretched as far as it could actually stretch. It was as white as snow, like it may have never seen daylight. But the skin was slick, covered in a faint sheen, almost like it was oiled or something. The eyes were wide and pitch black, soulless, evil. The mouth wasn't just a mouth. It stretched wider than it should have been, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and its lips were these thin, cracked little pieces of flesh. It looked like it was pulled back in a snarl, or like it was smiling some evil, twisted smile. It dropped to all fours so fast that I didn't even know whether to run or freeze. Adam and I both chose to freeze. The creature didn't move at first. It just stood there, staring at us, its head tilted to one side like it was trying to figure out what to do. I whispered to Adam. I told him we needed to run, but Adam wasn't moving. He was too shocked by the thing we were staring at, and I could see this pure look of terror on his face. And then this thing did move. It didn't run or charge. It was more like a fluid, unnatural glide. Its body jerked and twisted in ways that didn't seem possible. It moved on all fours. The claws on this thing were making these horrible scraping noises. It closed the distance between us in an instant. And the next thing I knew, it was just a few feet away from Adam. That snapped me out of it. I yelled at him to move. I grabbed his arm and yanked him away from that monster. We both bolted, running back towards the courtyard without a second thought. I didn't care about anything else. Nothing else mattered but getting the hell out of that place. Adam was right behind me, but every now and then I heard him stumbling. The hallway felt like it stretched on forever, and every step felt like it was taking us further into some dark abyss. We reached the first room we were in, and basically dove through one of the empty windows. I wasn't taking time to open any doors. We were outside, but I couldn't stop running. We ran across the yard. My legs were burning, and I didn't even care. The rake was right behind us. I could hear it. I saw our car. We were so close to the car. I could see it through the trees. But I could also hear the rake screeching right behind us. It was some horrible, inhuman, high-pitched screech. We reached the car in what felt like an eternity. My fingers were numb as I grabbed the keys from my pocket. Adam beat me to the car, banging on it in terror. I pressed the lock button and he jumped in, ready to go. I was right behind him. I threw the car into drive, and we sped the hell out of there. My tires squealed like I was Vin frickin' Diesel, and we peeled away from hell on earth. In the rearview mirror, I saw nothing. The rake was gone. We didn't talk on the drive home. There was nothing to say. We were both too shaken and too scared to speak. When we finally made it home, I sat in the car for a long time, staring out the windshield at the garage door. And then I actually started to cry. And that was the last time we ever went hunting for ghosts. In fact, we left all that shit behind in our hasty retreat. Adam even dropped his precious camera at some point, but who cares? I can't tell you exactly how long it took before I started to sleep again, but it wasn't easy. I know as we were talking, you told me that a lot of people that you've come into contact with that have seen creatures like this are plagued with sleepless nights and nightmares, and let me tell you, those are true. Because I experienced the same thing. When you see something like that, sleep isn't something that's easy to happen. And when you do sleep, you see that creature all over again. And it wasn't just the fear of the thing that we encountered, but it was this constant feeling that we hadn't really escaped it. Adam had nightmares too. He wouldn't talk about them, but I knew. He was always on edge. We did try to reach out for help once. We contacted a paranormal investigator online, a guy named Greg who had this impressive resume. But when we explained what had happened, Greg went quiet on the phone. I remember he asked a lot of questions, more than I was comfortable with, and then he told us to stop looking into it. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he knew exactly what we were talking about. He knew what we'd seen, but he didn't want to get involved. Through him, though, we did find out what it's called. The rake. We thought we were brave, that we could handle whatever the world threw at us. But we were wrong. There are things out there no one should ever see. Things that haunt you. Things that make you question the world you thought you knew. This creature, this rake, wasn't something that we could understand. Some things are better left in the dark. Some things don't need to be understood. But the rake is real. I will testify that like everybody else that you talk to. And I will also never forget what happened that night. Thank you. Have a good one. My name is Jake Miller, and this all happened 2 Septembers ago in New York, just a few months after graduating high school. I was 18, fresh into college classes, and still getting used to the responsibility of college. I never partied in high school, didn't plan on doing it in college either, so what I'm about to tell you happened to me and my girlfriend when we were stone cold sober. It wasn't a hallucination, or anything like that. I've always been more of a go find something cool to explore kind of guy. I like skateboarding, staying up late playing video games, and wandering around empty suburban areas at night. Something about the quiet of those spots, or the way an old tunnel or abandoned lot felt like a ghost town, always got my curiosity going. It was a weird hobby, I guess, but it gave me a sense of adventure without doing anything too crazy. My girlfriend Mia thought it was mostly harmless. She's my age, 18 too, and we'd been together since junior year. Mia's a lot of things I'm not. Grounded, cautious, way smarter about avoiding trouble. Were I to get excited about going into a dark alley or some forgotten building, she'd roll her eyes and call me dumb. But then she'd tag along anyway. Mia loves reading, fantasy novels mostly, and had a thing for stargazing. She could name constellations like it was second nature, pointing out Orion's Belt or Scorpio or Taurus, so exploring parks and whatnot after dark was fun for her too. But more than anything, Mia just liked being outdoors. She liked hiking trails, long walks, sitting by the water. She was all about open air. She'd come from a pretty crappy home life too, so being away from it always just made her smile. We were different in a lot of ways, but it worked. I think it's because we balanced each other out. Me pulling her into adventures and her making sure I didn't get myself killed. She cared about me, and she trusted me enough to follow along. I cared about her just as much, and I'd never push her into something I thought was actually dangerous. That's why, when all this happened, it hit us so hard. We'd never been reckless, never taken any real risk. That night was supposed to be like all our other adventures. Just a quiet walk, just killing time. But that night, everything changed. It was one of those early September nights where summer weather was still in the air, but it was starting to get a little bit cooler. We'd been wandering through this little park by our house. It wasn't Central Park or anything. This place was smaller and quieter. We lived out of the city. This park had lampposts spaced too far apart, and you'd see maybe 1 or 2 people during the day, but absolutely nobody at night. That's why I liked it. It was around midnight at this point, and we were enjoying the ability to stay out as late as we wanted to now that we were in college. No more curfew. The streets were empty, and the park itself was abandoned. It seemed even quieter than usual, though, like the whole place was even more void of squirrels and birds and even bugs than usual. I remember thinking how weird it was. Normally, you'd hear all kinds of things making noise, but that night, super quiet. We'd been walking for a while, talking about college, complaining about classes, just enjoying the time together. And that's when we got to this tunnel. It's off to the side, near the edge of the park. It's not huge, just wide enough for pedestrians and cyclists to pass through. And it looked old. The entrance is framed with cracked concrete, with patches of moss and ivy clinging to the edges. There's graffiti sprawled across the walls, but even that's faded and old too. Most of it looked like symbols or messy scribbles. Mia didn't want to walk through it, even though we'd gone through that tunnel dozens of times during the day. I reminded her of that, but she said, "Don't tell me that doesn't look like a murder scene just waiting to happen." She had a point. At night, it was so dark inside that I couldn't see where it ended, and it echoed the dripping water inside and the little breeze that was passing through it. It was definitely creepy. That's why I had to walk through. For the fun of it. "It's just a tunnel," I told her. "We'll walk through and then we'll head home. 2 minutes tops." She sighed and agreed with me and told me I was lucky that she likes me. I am a pretty lucky guy to have her, by the way. For a few seconds, I hesitated though. Maybe she was right. I felt the hair on my neck kind of stand up, and I couldn't shake that we're being watched feeling. The longer we hesitated by the entrance, the stronger it got. I glanced around. Nothing but the park. It was just empty. I shook it off though. I was just letting Mia's creeps get to me, right? I took her hand and said, "Shall we?" She rolled her eyes at me and said my sense of adventure was going to get us killed someday. Then we stepped into the tunnel. Our footsteps echoed against the walls because everything else was so quiet. The deeper we went, the quieter it seemed to get, until all we could hear was our shoes against the ground. The moment we stepped inside the darkness, it was just thicker in there, like the atmosphere was dense. The air was colder too. It was damp and smelly. Not gonna lie, I was getting more creeped out. My instincts were telling me that it was a bad idea this time. But again, I pushed those thoughts back. Now you see why I said Mia's the smart one, right? I tried to focus on Mia's hand, but the farther we walked, the more the tunnel seemed to stretch. For a moment, I swore those shadows were moving too. Mia wanted to turn around, but I told her we were already halfway through, and that we were fine. I was lying, of course. I didn't feel fine at all. And then I started hearing this weird noise. It was like this weird shuffling, like someone dragging their feet, and it echoed from the far end of the tunnel. I stopped walking and Mia froze too. The sound wasn't loud, but in that eerie silence, it was impossible to miss, and it definitely echoed down to us. It didn't sound like a small animal either. It sounded larger. I held my breath and squinted, trying to see into the darkness. At first, there was nothing, but then I caught movement. Then this thing stepped into view, just far enough that the light caught its shape. My heart stopped. It looked human. At first. Pale, so thin that it couldn't be alive. You could see bones through this nasty pale skin, and the bones looked like they were going to pop out of the skin because the skin was so tight. Its limbs were too long too, like too long to be real. It honestly looked like one of those man-sized Halloween decorations that crouch on its hands and feet and pops up to scare you. It was crouched down on all fours, and its elbows stuck out at high angles. Its butt was high in the air too. It wasn't just pale. It was colorless, like its skin had never seen sunlight. Its head turned towards us slowly, almost like the movements hurt it. And I could see the face then. The face that will probably haunt me forever. I could see the outline of the skull underneath it because the skin was pulled just as tight on the face as the rest of the body. It had cheeks that looked hollow and a mouth that hung open so wide it looked like it was just a hole in its face. It didn't have glowing eyes, not like the monsters in movies, but its eyes caught the light like a cat's. They were wide and unblinking and empty, and they were as black as a shark's. It also had long fingers and claws that looked filthy. For a few seconds, that felt like the longest moments of my life, it just stared at us. And then it moved. Its limbs jerked when it began crawling forward. Its fingers scraped against the ground as it moved, and it ran on all fours, but not like a normal animal. It was like a shuffling that a person would do, only faster than any human could do like that. The movements were wrong too, like its joints didn't bend the way they were supposed to. Every step looked painful, like its bones were twisting. Its back was arched high, like some awful spider half collapsed on the ground. I couldn't breathe or move. I was too scared. I could only watch as it crept towards us, and I could hear the nails clicking against the concrete. And then it stopped. For a moment, I thought, or at least hoped, that this thing was going to retreat. But instead, its body tensed. I could see its shoulder blades beneath its skin as it sank lower to the ground like it was getting ready to charge. And you know what? It did charge. Right after that. This thing launched itself forward with a screeching sound that echoed through the tunnel so loud I thought my ears would never stop ringing. It moved on all fours, jerky and twisting but wicked fast. Nothing alive should move like that. It was twitching and skittering like some messed up movie monster, only this was right in front of us, and it was very real. I yelled at her to run, and we sprinted out of there, but it kept chasing us. The sound it made, some awful mix of screeching and growling, let us know that it was right behind us, and I wasn't looking back. The far end of the tunnel seemed so far away. The creature's footsteps made this horrible slapping sound, like wet flesh hitting concrete. But then suddenly, the sound changed. I heard something sharp, like nails raking against the wall. I risked a chance to look back, and I actually screamed. This thing was skittering along the tunnel wall like a spider. Its limbs were spread at impossible angles as it clawed at the wall. It was like this thing defied gravity, and its mouth was still hanging open like it was grinning. I looked back. We were almost to the end of the tunnel. We could see light outside. It was literally the light at the end of this terrifying tunnel, and we ran for everything we had. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not in the best of shape. My legs felt like they were actually gonna fall off of my body, and my chest felt like it was gonna explode. But I didn't stop. I kept pulling Mia forward, knowing she probably felt the exact same way as I did. Knowing that our bodies wanted to give up, but adrenaline is a hell of a thing. I knew that thing was closer than ever, and I wasn't gonna let it hurt her. Almost there is the only thing that I could think. We burst out of the tunnel a split second before I felt something, maybe its hand, just behind me. Mia stumbled to the grass, pulling me with her, and we collapsed. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought that if that creature didn't kill me, my heart would. I couldn't stop myself from turning back to the tunnel for a look, but that thing was gone. Still though, the park felt wrong, like something evil was still there. To make it worse, everything was still dead silent too. The air felt like it was charged with electricity, but it also felt colder than it should have been, especially after running so hard. Mia felt it too and said we needed to leave before it came back. But we didn't get a chance to run before it really did come back. We both heard the thud, thud, thud of footsteps. The sound wasn't constant. It would stop for a few seconds at a time, then pick up again. Worse was the breathing. There was this deep, ragged noise that drifted through the air, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. We both looked around, afraid to run in case we ran towards it instead of away from it. She asked me where it was, but I was clueless. We just held on tight to each other, panting in short, scared breaths. I couldn't see it anywhere, but I knew that it was out there. And I knew that it was hunting us. I could feel it. Somewhere in the dark, the creature was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then I saw a glimpse of it, skittering in the grass behind a couple of big trees. It was still on all fours, with that same weird jerking movement. Mia saw it too and screamed. I yelled at her to run as I grabbed her arm and pulled her towards the park's entrance. I didn't need to look back to know that it was closing in. I could hear those horrible footsteps, and they sounded like when you run on bare feet. That slap, slap, slap noise, just like it was in the tunnel. The sound darted around us, like it was circling us, trying to cut us off. And then I saw something that gave me more hope than I'd had since I saw that damn thing. A police car. It was parked near the entrance of the park. The headlights were off, but it didn't matter. Someone was there. Someone who could actually help us. We ran to the officer, yelling for help before we even got to him. It was still right behind us, though. Its growls mixed with the click, click, click of its nails against the pavement and that slap, slap, slap of its flesh hitting the ground. We got to the grass near the park's edge, trying to yell for help as loud as possible. I was waving my arms as we closed the distance to the patrol car. The driver door opened, and a police officer stepped out. His flashlight cut through the dark. He yelled at us, asking if we were okay, but we just kept yelling that it was chasing us. He drew his gun, ready to fire if need be. When we finally reached him, I couldn't run another step. I couldn't even breathe. Mia clung to my arm, shaking. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to force air into my lungs so I could tell this police officer what the hell was going on. We tried to explain that something was chasing us, that it was right behind us. The officer was visibly concerned, but trying to stay calm. He moved us behind him and started shining his light into the darkness. There was no sign of that creature anywhere. The path was empty. The tunnel was empty. It was gone. The officer turned back to us, asking if it was an animal. It wasn't an animal, I said. It looked like a person, but it wasn't human. He just kind of stared at us for a moment. He must have seen something in us because of his expression. It softened. I doubt he believed us, but I think he at least believed that we were terrified enough to not be lying to him. He told us to stay there and that he'd take a look. He started towards the path, his flashlight sweeping back and forth, but I grabbed Mia's hand and pulled her towards the patrol car. I wasn't about to stand there, staring into the dark, waiting for that thing to come back. All I could think was that that thing was going to pounce on this poor officer, and then we'd be back at square one. But it didn't pounce on him, and he didn't find anything. Not in the tunnel, not in the playground, not anywhere in the park. But he didn't question us either. He didn't roll his eyes or laugh it off like we were crazy. Instead, he just drove us home, watching us in his rearview mirror like he was trying to figure out what had scared us so badly. I didn't have an answer for him. And you know what? I still don't have an answer for him. It's one of the main reasons that I'm reaching out to you, is so people on here can tell me what the hell it was that they think that I saw. On the way home, the officer didn't say much, but I could tell he didn't think we were making it up. Maybe it was the way we looked, or maybe it was how we clung to each other in the back seat, barely speaking. When we got home, I expected my parents to grill me about what had happened, but the officer must have been careful with his words. All he told them was that we'd been chased, probably by an animal, and that we were lucky to have gotten away without any injuries. I didn't argue. I couldn't. Even if I tried to explain, what would I have said? That a pale, emaciated creature with black eyes had crawled after us like something out of a nightmare? That it skittered like a giant spider from hell? There's no way they would believe me. That night is when the nightmares started. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the tunnel. I could see that thing step into the light. How its ratcheted movements, that jerky crawl, would appear from the shadows. I'd hear the screeching, and then I'd wake up, soaked in sweat, my heart pounding. Sometimes, Mia would text me in the middle of the night, saying she couldn't sleep either, that she'd had another dream. Neither of us had to explain what the dream was about. We both knew. It got better eventually, though. Not all at once, but little by little. The nightmares came less often. The paranoia faded. A year passed. Mia and I stayed together, and I think a big part of it was the bond that we shared. No one else could understand what we'd been through. No one else could understand that kind of fear. It was our secret, this thing that we carried together. I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 times since that night, but no matter how many excuses I make, none of them explain the way that it moved, or the sound it made, or the sheer terror that I felt. That thing wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal either. I've done a lot of research, and there's a lot of things that it could be. None of them that I want to put on paper, though. I guess I just don't want to say the names out loud. I'll let you guys use your imagination for that. I don't think I'll ever know exactly what it was because there's so many things out there that it could be. But whatever it was, I sure as hell hope that I never see it again. My name is Marge. No last name, please. I work in education, but I don't want to give you the whats and wheres of that. It was late October when I decided to rent a cabin in the woods. I'd been buried in work for months and I needed to disconnect for a weekend. You know what I mean? No notifications, no city noise. Just me, my dog Clover, and nature. The place I found was this little rental in rural Pennsylvania, tucked in a forest I'd never even heard of. It was perfect, or at least it seemed perfect on the listing. The photo showed a cozy log cabin with a wooden burning stove, a little front porch, and acres of forest surrounding it. The kind of place where you could hear yourself think. When I got there, it was just as I imagined. The leaves were turning red and orange, mixed with brown and yellow, and a mist hung low over the ground, making everything feel just peaceful. And Clover? He was thrilled. He bolted out of the car, tail wagging, his nose already glued to the ground. At first, I loved it. The quiet, the isolation, it was everything that I'd been craving. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird call, and Clover sniffing around the porch like he'd just discovered heaven. I spent the first couple of hours just settling in, unpacking, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The air smelt different, and the atmosphere was just so calm. But as evening came, that atmosphere changed. It's hard to describe, but there was this strange shift. The forest didn't feel as inviting anymore. The daylight disappeared faster than I expected to, and the shadows crept in quickly. By the time I realized it, the porch light was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. And the forest got really, really quiet. Quieter than I imagined. There weren't even any crickets or birds. There weren't any people around. There was just nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, and Clover pacing around the cabin like he wasn't sure where to settle. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being out there alone. I was used to the chaos of the classroom, but deep down, I felt like something was off. I tried to push it out of my mind, I guess. Maybe I should have listened to my instincts. The first night I was there was just strange. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place, but I kept waking up. At first it was Clover that startled me. He was usually a sound sleeper, but he kept shifting around, getting up, pacing near the door. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to this faint scratching sound outside too. It wasn't loud by any means, just enough to make me freeze in bed and sit there and listen. It could have been anything, I guess. A raccoon or branches scraping against the cabin in the wind. I stayed under the blankets though, telling myself it was nothing, and eventually the sound stopped. The next morning, when I went out to let Clover stretch his legs, I saw something weird though. There was these scratches on the porch railing. Long, deep grooves, like something with claws had dragged them down the wood. I bent down to get a closer look. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been there when I arrived, and I was sure of that. Clover wasn't acting like himself either. He kept sniffing the porch, then backing away like he didn't like what he smelled. I tried to get him to wander into the clearing like he had the day before, but he wouldn't go far. He just stayed close to me, ears perked and tail low. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just picking up on my nerves. I decided to take him on a hike to shake the feelings off. The woods were gorgeous in the daylight, and I figured a little exercise would help us both relax. But that's when I found these patches of dirt that looked like they'd been dug up and put back down. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe something burying food scraps. There were these shallow pits dug near the base of these trees, but the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. The holes weren't scattered randomly. They were clustered together in a way that felt methodical, like someone or something had been digging with a purpose. By the time we got back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us either. Clover kept looking over his shoulder, his hackles raised, and every so often I caught myself doing the same thing. I'd never gotten more cases of goosebumps in one day than that day. But that night was worse. The scratching came back, louder this time, and with it, something else. It was faint, almost like a whisper. I couldn't make out any words, but it was there, just outside of the cabin. My phone wasn't helping either. It'd been fine when I arrived, but now it was acting up, losing signal, draining battery like crazy. It died completely sometime that night, leaving me with nothing but the cabin's dim lights and Clover, who was growling softly at the front door. That didn't calm my nerves any. In fact, it just made the situation worse. I kept telling myself, though, that it was my imagination, that I was out there alone and I'd seen one too many scary movies, but deep down, I think part of me knew that something just wasn't right. I felt it in my chest. It was a feeling like a cold, gnawing sense of unease, and that feeling just wouldn't go away. I was already on edge from the sounds and the weird holes, but when I woke up to Clover whining and scratching at the door, I felt a cold jolt run through me. His usual bark had turned into a low whimper, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Half awake, I stumbled out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. Clover still wasn't acting himself. His body was stiff, and his eyes were wide with fear, and he was staring at the door like something was on the other side. I knelt down trying to calm him, but my heart was already pounding in my chest. Something was wrong. I knew it now, and I wasn't pretending anymore. I opened the door a crack. It was pitch black outside. No light pollution from the city, no lights outside besides the porch light. Just the darkness of the woods. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then as I moved the flashlight across the edge of the clearing, I saw something. It was some misshapen form that was standing just outside the reach of the porch light. It was tall, extraordinarily tall, and it was so still it was like it was frozen in place. This figure was pale. Its skin was almost white, and it stretched tightly over the bones. It was humanoid in shape, but everything about it felt wrong, and it sent my brain into this primal survival instinct. The limbs were too long and too thin. The way it stood, with its head tilted slightly to one side, made it look like it didn't belong in this world. And there was something about its posture that just looked like it was, I don't know, in pain or uncomfortable in its own body. Needless to say, I froze. I couldn't move or even breathe. The flashlight beam caught its eyes, and they glowed faintly in the darkness. 2 points of sickly light reflecting back at me, and it felt like those eyes were staring directly into my soul. The thing didn't make a sound. It didn't move. It just watched me. Clover let out another frantic whine, and I snapped out of that trance that I was in. I slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I bolted it, but I couldn't stop looking out the window. My eyes were locked on the spot that thing had stood. I thought it disappeared, but then I heard something moving fast around the cabin. It circled the cabin, darting from tree to tree like it was trying to see if I was still watching. The air around me seemed to thrum with the sound of scratching and scraping along the outside of the walls. The cabin groaned under the pressure. The windows rattled, like whatever's out there was testing my defenses. Clover was beside himself now, barking and pacing back and forth between the windows. I didn't even know how to react. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure whether to stay inside or run, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe there. I reached for my phone, but it was dead again. It'd been fully charged just hours before, but now it wouldn't even turn on. Nothing, and panic surged through me. Desperate, I grabbed the first thing I could find, a kitchen knife. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was all I had, and at least it was some kind of defense. I flicked on the flashlight and held it out in front of me, hoping that it would do something, anything, to stop the terror that was creeping closer to me. Everything in me wanted to run, to leave the cabin and to get in the car and drive as fast as I could, no matter where. But the roads were dark, If it found me there, in the middle of nowhere, there'd be no escaping. I couldn't believe what was happening. I was trapped, completely. Totally, utterly trapped. I pressed my back against the wall. I still had the knife, but it was useless. There was nothing I could do to fight whatever that thing outside was. Clover started going insane, barking at one of the windows. I looked up at the window he was barking at, and couldn't hold back my scream, because there that thing was. The creature. The monster. It was pressed against the glass, its face so close that I could see every horrifying detail. Its skin was like stretched pale leather. Bones jutted out at odd angles. Its fingers were curled around the edge of the window, and the nails were scraping against the glass. Its eyes were hollow, like pits of black that seemed to suck in the light. But there was something worse about them now. Something that felt like they were looking into me, past me, seeing everything. It started making this whispering sound, and I threw my hands to my ears because I didn't want to hear it. Then it did the same thing. These long, nasty, skinny, bony fingers shot up to the sides of its head where the ears should be. And then I realized it was mimicking me. Those whispers sounded like a voice to me, and my blood turned to ice. Its voice was this raspy, broken terror, like a dying man trying to speak through the fog. But it was still speaking, and I heard my damn name come out of this thing's mouth. It wasn't human, I could tell, but the tone, the way it sounded, almost like someone in desperate need. It was enough to rattle every nerve in my body. This thing learned my name, and was using it against me. I backed away from the window. My hand tightened around the knife, and I pressed my back into the wall, hoping that somehow it would stop. It darted away, but I knew that it wasn't gone. It was probably just trying to find some other window to look through, or some way to get into the house. And then I heard the scratching again, this time at the door. It wasn't soft like before. It was violent, like something was trying to tear through. The door frame shook with each strike. Clover was barking furiously, and even he was starting to sound more afraid, though. He kept running from window to window, trying to get closer, but he would start to whine when he got too close to one of the windows. I knew I couldn't just wait this thing out, but the thought of running, of just throwing myself into the night and hoping for the best, that wasn't something that I was willing to do. Where would I even go? What would I do? How fast was this thing? Would I even make it to my car? Clover barked louder now, running toward the door with his hackles raised. He lunged forward, hitting the door so hard it made the windows rattle. I didn't know how he was still this brave, but somehow his frantic barking seemed to distract that thing outside. It made this noise like a screech, a sound like nails on a chalkboard. Then it began circling again, faster now, like it was testing Clover. Clover was moving in slow circles, watching the walls where I'm assuming this thing was moving, and he could sense it. I chanced looking out of the window. It wasn't close to the house now. It was further away, but it didn't retreat far. It just waited, watching. Then, without warning, it turned and bolted into the woods. Clover was still acting on high alert, though. He was still barking, but the air felt different now. The tension was gone, like the air wasn't as heavy, I guess. I didn't dare leave the cabin. I don't know what that thing was that was out there, and I didn't know if it was waiting for me to let my guard down or not. I just couldn't risk my life or my dog's life. All I know is, though, I survived. Just barely, probably. But I'll never forget the eyes. Those hollow, dark eyes, and the way it called my own name. There was something about it that just felt like it was trying to lure me outside, even though I had already seen it, and there was no way in hell that I was going to follow that thing out there. Maybe it was just some tactic that it learned. In the morning, the events of the night were still too fresh to feel relieved. I was absolutely terrified of going outside, but I knew that I had to leave, and the daylight was my best option, because at least then I could see. I had no idea what that thing was capable of, or how to hurt it, or what it would do to me if it caught me. And I still had no clue what it was, and no guess to even begin to figure out what it was. But I knew that we needed to get the hell out of that cabin. I dared to look outside again. The clearing seemed empty, and it was bright with sunlight. I ventured outside, slowly and cautiously. I'd never been more aware of my surroundings in my entire life. The cabin itself was scarred. The doorframe was battered, the wood splintered where it had been scraped by something sharp. There were claw marks on the walls, and the windows were cracked. The creature looked like it had tried to claw its way through. Clover was out there with me. He was my warning signal if that thing came back, because he could sense it far earlier than I could. Thankfully, he was acting like his old self, but he stuck close to me the entire time, like he was afraid to let me out of his sight. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up quickly, not bothering to make the place look presentable or worry about the damage. I just needed to leave. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. When I got back to Philly, I wasn't any less terrified because I couldn't shake the memory of that thing, especially that face, or those eyes, and the way that it mimicked me and tried to lure me outside. I told a few friends about it. Some were sympathetic, but others just dismissed it. They told me I was probably stressed out, and I'd had a vivid nightmare. Part of me wanted to believe them, I really did, but there was no way that I could. The evidence out there that I saw was irrefutable. What I'd went through was definitely real, and it was some kind of otherworldly monster that had attacked that cabin. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I started researching. I had to know what it was that I'd seen. I needed to know what was out there in the woods that night. I made a list of all the things it could have been. Maybe a skinwalker, or a crawler, a fleshgate perhaps, or maybe even a wendigo. My list just seemed to be getting longer and longer. I even went as far as looking into cryptids, searching through creepypasta stories online, and everything else that I could read. And that's when I found it. The rake. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I read, the more it fit. The hollow eyes, the long limbs, the way it moved in the shadows. It was exactly what I saw. But everyone online said the rake was just a creepypasta. A story made up to scare people. They even said that there were no real reports of it, just urban legends. But I know what I saw. It wasn't some story, and it wasn't some make-believe creature. I've never been one for believing in monsters or cryptids, but now I know better. The rake is real, and I saw it myself.